Thank you very much for welcoming me to Perspectives Men's Breakfast. The bad news is that considering my wife Lynn and myself, she has the bigger word ration every day, and so I may or may not struggle to spit out my words to you at this hour on a Saturday morning. But the good news is that as I look around the room and as I reflect back on 10 years in the Tyne Valley, having moved to Hexham in 2010, I realise that I now know quite a lot of you, a little bit at least, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. So, as Donald introduced us, we've been working for Wycliffe Bible translators since the early 90s, and we spent the biggest chunk of our time out in Ethiopia, and so I'll be talking a bit about our experience in that country. But I thought we'd step back from that. This is what we're doing today, making friends at the edge of the world, how Bible translation really happens. Well, I can't tell you everything about Bible translation in 25 minutes, but we'll see where we get to. There are lots of difficult things in life, aren't there? And one of the difficult things that I'm facing at the moment is trying to care for my elderly parents. They're both in Hexham now, in 2 different care facilities. And I realise that I don't know how to do it. And I don't have the answers to all of their needs, physical or spiritual or social. And sometimes I recognise that I just simply haven't got enough to give as I try and do some work and try and attend a church and also look after them. And not knowing how to do it certainly applies to Bible translation as well, when you set out on a journey towards that, because most people don't have a background in that. So what is the starting point? I realized very early on that I'm not the starting point in this whole thing about Bible translation. Bible translation is one important part of God's mission to his world. I often think of God reaching out into his world, and perhaps if you think about the heart of God, you could think about God longing for something, God longing for a response from human beings. And so I think it's helpful to think of mission as starting in the heart of God. Over the years, in this country and Western countries, often mission, or sometimes missions, plural, has been seen as human activity or church activity. But really the missio Dei, the mission of God, is really his business. He's the starting point. So what's our role then? Our role as people who might be willing to go is to listen, to respond. And there are lots of people who long for different things, longing to hear about God. As we realized where we came into the story of doing Bible translation in Ethiopia, we realized that even at a human level, we weren't the starting point, because long before we arrived on the scene, we realized that there had been groups of people praying for the people that we eventually went to, people in the West who'd heard about their need and were already praying for them long before we'd heard of the place. And what are the kind of responses do human beings make? Well, there's all sorts of organizational level responses. So as well as people praying, there are organizations planning. So Wycliffe has had a long history of identifying what the languages are in the world today, where the needs are most acutely felt. Not only Wycliffe, but its partner organization SIL, which is the technical wing, if you like, of Wycliffe, the people that understand the linguistics and the language needs. Also Bible Society, that you'll have heard of. And of course the big church denominations in any given country who are seeking to reach people within their own national borders. So in our case, several big church denominations in Ethiopia were planning long before we ever got from our point of view, Lynn and I, as we were sitting in South London at that time, we experienced some longing as well. In a most general sense, we were longing as Christians to follow God, to follow his plan for our life. And so we experienced some aspects of longing just to be useful to God and his world. At an even more basic level, we were longing for some more excitement outside of the M25. And we couldn't imagine dedicating our whole lives to London or to institutions within it. I had an IT background at that time, and I was, in one sense, employed by a big insurance company, but it wasn't very exciting. Also, a longing to be back in Africa. I'd been born in Africa, but didn't have any memory of it. I was back in England before I was 2, but there's always a sense that I somehow belonged somewhere else, so I was personally longing to be back there. And then respond. Let's see some of the... Oh, going the wrong way here. We were responding to some quite challenging numbers here, in one sense. As we found out more about Wycliffe, this was before we ever went anywhere, we learned that there are 7,000 plus languages currently spoken in the world today. Only 700 of those in the Bible. This is not being kind to me. 700 of those have a... Let's swap again, shall we? "700 have a complete Bible." That's not really enough, is it? And slightly more encouragingly, another 1,500 or so of those languages have at least a New Testament available already. But there's almost 4,000 languages still with no scripture at all. Now, to be honest, not all of those languages may end up needing scripture because they'll have died out before Bible could be translated into them, but there's still a big challenge left. And so, under Wycliffe and under various other partner organizations, there are currently 2,500 plus active translation projects going on right now. Some of those led by churches and by Bible Society. But that's language numbers. What about in terms of numbers of people? I think it's accurate today. I was looking up these figures on the Wycliffe website just yesterday. I think they say that about 5.6 billion people still don't have access to a complete Bible in a language which they can really understand well. Or to put it perhaps even more simply, 1 in 5 people on the planet today don't have really access to any part of the Bible. So there's work yet to be done. I think Lynn and I were also responding to some ideas from the Bible. In Revelation, it talks about a picture of heaven in the end times, after this phase of the planet is wound up, where there's a picture that John sees of people from every nation and language and people and nation gathered round the throne worshipping the Lamb. And then on a more practical level in Romans, it says, how can people believe if they don't hear? How can they hear if people aren't sent to speak to them? How can we be sent? Well, Bible translation is part of that sending and hearing process. What was needed then? We had to do a lot of learning. For us, mission was about going somewhere different, crossing cultures, learning to adapt, and also learning not to dominate, learning to be with. And so we had to learn about mission. God's mission, as I said at the beginning, first and foremost. And then in terms of how to do it, not doing things for people. I think we often think of church life or mission as doing for, or even worse, doing things to people. Is that what we end up doing? I think it is sometimes. With the best will in the world. People don't always want things to be done for them. But as we learnt more about it, I think we felt that mission is most of all about being with people. Almost being fellow discoverers, perhaps fellow pilgrims on a journey with the people we went to. And the fact is that they have many of the answers themselves. We certainly don't bring all the answers with us just because we come from perhaps a more privileged background. We also had to learn a lot about languages. We spent a year doing the equivalent of an MA course in linguistics, and we had to learn about phonetics, which is the sounds that human mouth can make. More important than phonetics is phonology, because you can make all sorts of sounds with your mouth, but only some of them matter. So if you talk to people in Ethiopia, they probably wouldn't tell the difference in our part of Ethiopia between a P and an F. So if you say police or felice, they wouldn't distinguish any noticeable difference. They wouldn't perceive any difference, whereas we would. On the other hand, they make distinctions that we can't hear between a T or different kinds of S. So, yes, if I say terta, you could think of it as T-E-T-A, terta, then that would mean he drank in Amharic. If you say terta, they wouldn't understand. It wouldn't be making any sense because it's the wrong sort of T. Well, languages are like that. They're fascinating and complicated. And then everybody understands something about grammar, but usually in a foreign language. You probably, if you studied French at school, you'll know about French grammar. You may not be so aware of your own English grammar. You just speak it naturally, don't you? So we have to study the grammar of our own language sometimes. But we had to certainly learn how the grammar system of another language worked. And semantics is perhaps the most interesting part of learning about languages. A lot of communication is not just about the words on the surface. I was sitting in the kitchen the other day with Lynn, and I was in my usual mode of not spitting words out on a Saturday morning, and I said, I was saying, it's on the thing. And Lynn was at the other end of the kitchen looking for something, and because of the context of us trying to have breakfast, I had a pretty good idea what she was looking for, and I knew why she was rooting around in a certain cupboard to find it, and I knew that I'd put it somewhere else, but I couldn't think of the word. I said, is it just on the thing? And she knew exactly what I meant by the thing because of my context, and oh yes, there it is. So we hadn't communicated anything that made much grammatical sense, and the semantics of the sentence weren't very helpful either. So as well as semantics, we got what we call relevance, and so much of communication is picking up things from our environment or our context, which completes the meaning of what we're trying to say. And so this is why Bible translation can be difficult, because when you have a text, it relies so much on some background information that people in that setting will be familiar with. And when you translate it into another language, the setting may not be obvious at all. I brought some copies which I'll pass round later of Mark's Gospel in the Basqueto language. In that little Gospel booklet, there's the text written in an alien-looking script. But interspersed in the text, there are one or two pictures. For example, a picture of a house from some Palestinian setting, which is very different to the houses in their setting. So when the paralyzed man is being let down through the roof of a house to be laid at Jesus' feet, because they couldn't get him in through the door, then the picture supplies the background meaning, the background context, because it would make no sense whatsoever to try and let a man down through the roof of their grass huts. How would you get up there? So the context is everything, or nearly everything. Languages are interesting and fascinating. I don't expect you to see the contents of this slide. It's far too much small information on it. But just to get the idea that this is a timeline from left to right, and there are all these different languages that exist at different periods of history. I've picked out a subgroup of Afro-Asiatic languages for this slide. Afro-Asiatic languages are spoken across North Africa and across into the Middle East. And one branch of that Afro-Asiatic family of languages is the Semitic languages, and this is the group of Semitic languages. Well, it's a bit hard to see, but there's some familiar languages up there. Towards the top, there's Aramaic, which was spoken in Jesus' time, which is related in some way to modern Syriac on the right, spoken in Syria. You'll see about halfway down, just above halfway, with a continuing dotted line to the right, the Hebrew. That's ancient Hebrew. Hebrew is an interesting example of a Semitic language because ancient Hebrew is, of course, no longer spoken except by biblical scholars who want to understand the original language that the Old Testament was written in. Modern Hebrew is rather detached from ancient Hebrew, interestingly, because it was an artificial construct in the 20th century as the state of Israel was re-established. Diaspora Jews got together and decided they needed a modern version of Hebrew to speak in their newly formed state, so they picked up bits of Yiddish that they spoke and invented a new Semitic language, if you like, which drew as much from Aramaic streams as from ancient Hebrew. So languages are complex, fascinating, they're always shifting and moving. And the key thing from this slide is they exist in families. The Ethio-Semitic ones are at the bottom in purple. You can see an ancient language there called Ge'ez, which is no longer spoken, but it's used as a liturgical language in the church in Ethiopia, in the Orthodox Church, and still read today, if not very much understood today. But it spawned in later years these other languages which are perhaps more familiar, which like Tigrinya and Amharic. Amharic is the national language of Ethiopia, and that's the one we first learned when we went there. Here's another interesting thing about languages. I said they're always shifting. Languages are dying out. There's a tendency, almost like gravity, that arrow pointing downwards on the left, for languages to become less and less useful unless they're supported and maintained by institutions and by education. So there's a general drift downwards as history unfolds and languages are spoken at different levels, and you can see that different languages have different degrees of use. At the bottom, some languages are only now just remembered, and that would include things like Biblical Hebrew. Some languages may be used to unite groups of people. Grandparents speak a certain language, but we no longer use it in our present-day society. So languages can still have a historical unifying effect, even though they may not be in present use. Up towards the top of the diagram, you've got this concept of different groups of people using them or not. And if a given language, a minority language, is only spoken by adults, then it's already on the process towards decline. If it's still spoken by children in the community, then you're looking a generation ahead and you think this is a viable language. This is going to be continuing into the future as a useful means of communication. So if your children speak your language, that's a good sign. If it's used in education, reading and writing, and used by institutions, perhaps used in local government offices, then you're pretty secure and your language is viable and vibrant. So we'll come back to that slide towards the end. As I say, we went off to Ethiopia. We went in 1994 the first time, and we had to learn a language, first of all, one of those green languages, Amharic, an Ethio-Semitic language, because although it only appears in the northern part of the country, that darker green, it's actually a unifying national language, so we learnt that first. And then we travelled, you'll see a sort of brownish group towards the bottom left next to the blue group. That brownish group is a group called Omotic languages. This is an Afro-Asiatic language, but not a Semitic language, in fact. There's a group of Omotic languages which are only found in Ethiopia. Some linguists link them to that bigger group, the yellowish group to the right, which is the Cushitic branch. And so there are 80 plus languages spoken in Ethiopia today. And ours was one of those little, the one we studied and got to know was one of those little brownish coloured groups. Shall I go and point to it? Let me get out of my chair. This is the Basketo area just there, that little brown clump there. And there are about 100,000 people that live in a mainly rural community whose primary language is Basketo. So that was the group we were assigned to. Before we ever went to Ethiopia, we were given a single side of A4 paper on which were written 3 short paragraphs about 3 different language groups. And we had to choose on the basis of that which one to go for. And the reason we chose Basketo was because the church there, which already existed and was quite strong, had been asking the loudest for the longest time for some help to go and translate the Bible into their language. So we said yes to Basketo without knowing very much about it at all. It turned out that what we said yes to was the most remote language group that the Africa area director was responsible for. So across the whole continent of Africa, that was the hardest one to get to. And in fact, it took us a very long time to get there, as you'll see in a minute. As well as all the different languages, there are 3 different script systems, writing systems, if you like. A lot of the languages, especially the Semitic ones, use the Ethiopic script, which you'll see just below the map there. Some, especially the Cushitic languages, use something a bit more recognizable to us, using the Latin letters. There's 1 or 2 on the left-hand border, the western border with Sudan, which use Arabic script as well. Sometimes they have more than one written version of their language using more than one script. This is you can't see much behind at the back of the screen there, but this is the Ethiopic Fidel. It's not really an alphabet. It's what they call an abugida, or a syllabary, because each separate symbol represents a combination of a consonant and a vowel. So in most of those Semitic languages, which use the Ethiopic script, the Fidel, there are 7 different vowels. And so each of the 33 consonant shapes has 7 different variants. So this turns out to be one of the easier things to learn about Amharic. It doesn't look as at first, but there's a bit of a logic to the shapes. I won't try and teach you any of that today, but you do end up having 231 basic syllable shapes. Not as difficult as it sounds. What about Basketo? Well, of course, nothing had ever been written down. Often people ask, why can't you use Google Translate? Well, it's interesting. Google Translate isn't built up on a lot of rules. It's not built up on language rules. Well, there are some language rules built in. But Google Translate works on scanning thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of written texts. If you're about to write the first one, there's nothing for Google Translate to get its teeth into. so it can't do it for you. So how do we get to grips with Basketto then? With a tape recorder. In the early days with a cassette tape recorder, quite a good quality one, which is now in the safe hands of some Italian linguist who borrowed it from me once. But nonetheless, while we had that, we recorded a lot of high quality tape recordings of words, of simple sentences and stories. And we had to get them repeated to us over and over and over again. So the first step in Bible translation is to bore the pants off your language assistant by getting him to repeat things over and over again. And he can't believe that you haven't quite heard it right yet. But so listening and repeating and being like a child and trying to spit out the words, mimic the words that are being said. And then, as I touched on earlier, trying to work out from all those lists and the contrasts that you find, what are the significant sounds in this language? Where does the verb appear in my sentence? Is it at the beginning or the middle or the end? How do they express themselves? And what we discovered eventually, after doing lots of sort of comparisons and contrasts of these recordings, trying to write things down, we found that they had 30 basic consonants. In the back of that little copy of Mark's Gospel that I'll pass around, you'll see a chart of the Basketto syllabary, or the alphabet. And in common with most of the Omotic and Cushitic languages, they only have 5 vowels, although you'll see 6 characters because they reserve 1 character for a single consonant without a vowel. But before you get to the point of being able to write it, you have to make some decisions together about how you're going to represent the sounds. You may have identified which sounds are the most important and how many sounds you need to represent, but how are we going to write these down? And so one of the key things to work towards is a writing system. How are we going to spell words? Which script, in fact, are we going to use? I don't know what you think, but here I am at the front with a whiteboard in the house that we'd built in Basketto, in the office that we'd set up for these kinds of discussions, with a group of Basketto speakers from the church, from the local government. Who's making the decisions, would you say? It's not obvious, because some people would say that the linguist who has studied the language most will make some recommendations about what sort of writing system would be best fitted to the language. But in fact, the people from the local government probably are the most important people in the room there, because they have to look at the political aspects of linguistics and who they're associating with by choosing a certain sort of writing system. And so they made various decisions over the year or two that this was taking place about using either the Latin characters that we would be familiar with or the Ethiopian characters that other languages in Ethiopia would use. And eventually they decided to use the Ethiopian system. And there were pros and cons of representing Basketto in either one. So it wasn't obvious which one would be the best fit. But so discussing how to represent the sounds, discussing which letters would be appropriate. In any given language, you'll always find some unique sounds that need representing by a new symbol, perhaps. So even with that large, complicated Ethiopic Fidel with 231 basic shapes, there were still some sounds that we needed which were on top of that for Basketto. So we had to decide how to adapt certain characters to represent those sounds. This is a big deal for a remote rural language community, and when they finally decided on it and agreed it and produced the first little dictionary in their language, the television cameras from Addis Ababa came all the way down to this remote rural place, 2 days' drive on largely dirt roads, and they recorded the announcement about the writing system in Basketto. This was a huge deal. But I want to take us back a bit, because I said, how does Bible translation really happen? And it's not just all about studying the language. There's so much else that goes on. I don't know if you can see the road winding from right to left halfway up that mountainside there. That's the sort of road that made it very difficult to access Basketo. Landslides from above would regularly block that narrow track, and there was no way round. So some years we couldn't really get there at all because there was too much mud on the road. The bigger roads weren't always an improvement either, because people weren't used to them. And where they put a drainage channel in that main road at the bottom right, some teenager, I guess, driving at night with his bus hadn't noticed that the drainage channel hadn't been filled in. In the early days, before they built us a bridge, the first bridge was washed away, but we had to drive through some rivers to get to Basketo. That was when it was nice and low. Sometimes it would be washing over the top of the wheels. That was more alarming. Every year people would be swept downstream. And to be honest, very few cars went that way, of course, in those early days. We had to learn how to eat and drink in different ways, using our hands, food that wasn't immediately familiar. There's our daughter Emily, when she was very much younger, cooking some Ethiopian injera, a sourdough pancake. And there's one of the ladies in the church making very strong Ethiopian coffee, which we learnt to love. We also had a few parts of the building trade. Eucalyptus trees were cut down in great quantity to help us build our house and office. And some bits from further afield, because of the problems with that road, had to be brought in by helicopter. So we did that with the help of an agency which allowed us the use of helicopters at lower cost than usual. So we brought windows and doors into the area that way. And trying to get a water tank put up involved lots of people, and alarmingly some old ladies with also strength of biceps and long wooden poles to help push it up. So everybody was involved. So building, and all of this took a huge amount of time. I'm trying to fix some solar panels on the roof to power a laptop computer, at least, so that we could do some analysis in the area. Building is not just about the buildings. Building is, of course, about the friendships. And I think, if anything, this is the key to doing Bible translation. This is how Bible translation really happens, is becoming comfortable. It's at the edge of the world with groups of people that you wouldn't expect to be close to in some ways. I remember kneeling on the floor of a church building with a few church leaders as we tried to pray in the early stages of the project, realizing that we were worshipping the same God. It was very evident that what he was doing in their lives was very similar to what he was doing in my life. And so we might be an ex-IT specialist and a rural farmer kneeling side by side in a small, dusty, concrete-floored church office. But despite all the differences, we had so much in common, because what God was doing inside of us, the Holy Spirit is one and works in us in remarkable ways. Learning to be comfortable. I've got to tell you a story. Have I got time? I'm afraid I've lost my... Yeah, I'm getting towards the end. Let me tell you a quick story. Lynn was learning a lot about how to survive and enjoy being in Basketo. And one Saturday morning, she went to the butcher's and ordered and bought a nice piece of beef from the butcher's. She came home, and we enjoyed that meat for the rest of the week. The next Saturday morning, she went again, No, the next Saturday morning, I get the story right, she sent our house worker, a fellow, to the butcher's because we'd learned in the intervening week that women were not be buying the meat. Women were supposed to be cooking the meat. The men bought the meat. So we sent our house worker, who was a man, off to the butcher's to buy the meat, and they wouldn't sell it to him because they wanted the white woman to come again. They thought it was so fun. And so Lynn had to go, otherwise we'd have no meat for the week. So sometimes you tread on the toes of another culture and they laugh and adapt to you as you adapt to them. And you make friends through mistakes as well as through careful study and cautious adaptation. We also did some training. And here again, we are learning as well as teaching. Here's Lynn in a classroom learning some advanced things about discourse, how languages work at the highest level, how stories get told and how signals are given in a story, like Once Upon a Time. That indicates a certain thing about your story. For example, in that case, it might not be a true story if you start Once Upon a Time. But the big picture, discourse features of a language. And Lynn is learning alongside our Ethiopian co-translators. Sorry, these come out rather dark on this screen, but there's one of our dear colleagues, Garris, who's sitting in front of an open Bible, but he's also got a laptop computer in front of him. So how does Bible translation really happen? Well, the best person to translate a text into a language are the native speakers of the language, so we can give them lots of support as experts from the outside in some sense, some experience to bring of how languages work, but the best people to do the translating are always the national, local language speakers. So we're helping them rather than the other way around. In 2014, I think it was, the end of, the big day came when the New Testament had all been translated. It took many, many years to do that, perhaps closer to 20 years than we'd like to admit. But the day came when, from Korea, the Bible Society of Korea that had published these booklets at low cost, had shipped them all out to Ethiopia, and we had the joy of going back from Hexham all the way back to that remote spot in southwest Ethiopia to watch thousands and thousands and thousands of Basketo people assembling to watch the unpacking and the first distribution of the Basketo New Testament. That was a superb day. It's imprinted on our memories forever. And again, they were center stage. We, of course, were there, and we spoke to them as well. But the real heroes in the story were not us, but them. They carried the project all those years and really done the translation. Here are some of the New Testaments in a box being unpacked. Back to this slide, just very briefly. You'll see the effect of all this work in the Basketo language. It's taken from being quite a vibrant language to really quite a secure language, which is now used not only in the church with those New Testaments, Old Testament translation going on right now, but also in schools. So the local government-run schools are all using Basketo in written form for the first 4 years of children's education. So it has a community-wide impact, not just a church impact. As we finish, I just want to highlight two people. One of them, Getachew, on the left, and Gerisu on the right. Gerisu was the one in front of the laptop computer. He's still working on the Old Testament translation. Getachew on the left is now a translation consultant. He acquired a degree from a university in Kenya in translation studies. He's an expert linguist now. He's also, over the last couple of years, been in Jerusalem studying Old Testament Hebrew, so he can give support to that Old Testament translation phase. And these people really are the future, not just for their language, Basketo, but for supporting other language translation projects going on in Ethiopia and beyond. And because time has run out on me, I just thought I'd see, this is a completely optional thing, but if you would like to make a difference, with the websites the way they are now, it's very easy to locate how to give money. And if you would like to support Getachew, you think about getting onto the Wycliffe UK website and clicking the donate button. And under the donate button, there are various options. You can give to projects if you know about those, or you can give to people, or you can give more generally to wherever the need is greatest. This is not a strong sales pitch. It's just if you would like to respond and make a practical difference on this Saturday morning, you could get onto the Wycliffe.org UK website. And if you wanted to support somebody like Getachew, you can simply go to donate to people and put in his name and perhaps indicate that he's working at Wycliffe, Ethiopia. And you can pay in various easy ways. So there, I'll stop talking and I'll allow a minute or two for questions if the time is there. If not, you can catch me afterwards. Thank you very much.
Simon, it's a fascinating journey from your own calling to the establishment of that language in the New Testament. Just an amazing story. I suppose most of us here had no idea what was quite involved in the translation field until you've explained it to us. So thank you very much indeed. Our time is gone, but we might be able to take one question if anyone has a question. Anyone? Yes, one. Could you see that? Yeah. That's okay. Yeah.
Translating from a translation, so from English. Yes, well, of course, lots of Bible translation projects have been done over many years into many different languages. And as projects have been done, in most cases, reference is always made to the original biblical languages, so to Greek and Old Testament to Hebrew. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be an expert scholar in those languages, because as all these translation projects have been done over the years, people like the Bible Society have written detailed books of helps to translators which unpack the New Testament Greek for whatever language we happen to be using. So in reality, people like Getachew have grasped quite a lot about New Testament Greek, so they are accessing the original languages. But through all the software helps and the written books by Bible Society, they can read in English at least, where are some of the key translation issues that crop up? What am I likely to trip over? And what are the options that other translators before me have chosen between? What choices have they made? What are the implications of making certain choices over certain perhaps difficult passages? So yes, it always in some ways does refer back to the original biblical languages.